We will brief you of the outcome of this meeting, and then we have the time for just a few questions. So, HRVP Borrell, you have the floor.
Thank you. The development ministers met today with two items on the agenda. The first one was the global food security crisis, and the second one was a meeting with Filippo Grandi to study the situation of the refugees around the world, not only from Ukraine, also from Ukraine, but without forgetting other refugee crises in which the European Union has supported the High Commissioner for Refugees. The first was the discussion among ministers on the looming global food security crisis. It was also a market of food under stress before the war. But after the Russian attack against Ukraine, this crisis is becoming much worse, and today it endangers the food security of millions of people in many parts of the world. The Russian troops are bombing Ukrainian fields, not allowing the sowing of the crops, looting food stocks, blocking Ukrainian ports, and so increasing price for food and fertilizers. They have skyrocketed in many parts of the world. So the world's food supply is in danger, mainly due to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And the numbers speak for themselves. Last year, 2021, Russia and Ukraine were among the top exporters of cereals and sunflower seeds and oil with Ukraine, and these were accounting about 50% of world trade of sunflowers. Just to put an example, sunflower oil, 50% coming from Ukraine. And Russia is occupying or shelling parts of the arable Ukrainian land, and it is estimated that almost half of the winter wheat, almost 40% of rye, and more than 60% of corn to be harvested in summer 22 is situated in zones that are at risk. So these future crops will also be on risk. 20%, 30% of the areas on the winter cereal, maize and sunflower seed production in Ukraine will either remain unharvested or not be planted this spring. This to give an idea of how much the Ukrainian agricultural capacity will be damaged by the war. The consequence is that this food is missing and will be missing. And when it's not missing, it is expensive, much more expensive than many people can afford. If we spend more resources on food, they have less for education and health, and this will deepen poverty and inequalities. It's clear that the first victims will be vulnerable population around the world, particularly in low-income countries who depend on food and fertilizers imports. As I said, the situation was already very bad before the war. It was an estimated 193 million people in 53 countries were facing acute food insecurity. And you have a look at the figures, especially in the corn of Africa, of the people who can die from starvation in Ethiopia, in particular, in all the corn of Africa. The figures are really terrifying. But now the war has turned it into a full crisis, and the need for a global response from the global community has been at the debate today with the ministers. We have already made a two pledging conference to support the population in the Sahel and Lake Chad region, and the other on the Horn of Africa. And the European Union, with its Team Europe approach, has made important pledges to these two conferences. We have to look for additional money, and for that we need a Team Europe approach, calling for the budgets of the member states to be mobilized, because you know that the budget of the European Union cannot have deficit. So we can redirect, reschedule, reorient our resources, but it is an approach of the member states altogether that the solution can be found. Today we discuss about solidarity, emergency relief, to work on food affordability and macroeconomic stability. We work on how to boost production. We will support over 70 partners in boosting output and resilience and sustainability of their food systems to increase their food capacity in the medium term. Third, on trade, there are around 20 million tons of grains in the Ukrainian silos. They are blocked by Putin war. There are a lot of ships waiting to load this grain, and they cannot do it because the Russian Navy is blocking the Ukrainian ports. That's why we are trying to look for alternative ways of taking these grains to the people. We are at the Commission prepared this proposal for solidarity lanes. We call for the member states to implement it quickly. And we call also to our partners not to restrict global trade of agricultural products and inputs. And finally, to work on a multilateral basis with the United Nations, the G7, the Food and Agriculture Resilience Missions Initiative, and others that could gather the efforts of everybody. We are very much aware that after the mass diplomacy, remember the beginning of the COVID, and then the vaccine diplomacy, now we are entering into a period of food diplomacy. And we have to fight in a new additional battle of narrative to counter the Russia disinformation machine that tries to convince the world that the rise in price of food is a consequence of the sanctions imposed on Russia. By the contrary, this is not the sanctions. This is a false claim from Russia. It is the war itself which is producing this food crisis and its high price increases. Our sanctions do not counter food, do not counter agricultural products, do not counter fertilizers. We don't prevent Russian exports on these things because we knew that they could affect the world market on food and fertilizers. This has to be clear because the Russians insist once and again the price spike is consequences of the West sanctions against us. No, the tensions in the markets are consequences of the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. But we have to do more than to try to explain it. We have to present a plan in order to deal with the geopolitical consequences of this war, and we'll do it on the next Foreign Affairs Council in June, and I am sure the European Union Council will also deal with that on the next meeting. After this exchange on the food insecurity crisis, we had the opportunity to exchange with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi. It was the first time that Filippo was coming to the Foreign Affairs Council on the development formation. We had, thanks to him, an overview of the global situation on refugees around the world. 1 year ago, there were 84 million forcibly displaced persons, according with the last data that Filippo Grandi explained to us, we are reaching the red line of 100 million people forced to leave their homes, displaced around the world for many different reasons, from climate change to political instability, from war to hunger. 100 million people is more than the population of Germany. This is the population of Egypt. United Nations High Council for Refugees is a key partner for us, for the European Union, and for the member states also. We are the second largest donor to UNHCR, and we have seen how humanitarian needs they are at all-time high. The needs are growing much quicker than the generosity. Already in February this year, they were high, at the peak. And then came the Ukrainian war, and add 6 million refugees out of the Ukrainian border, and 7-8 million inside Ukrainians. So this is why we are reaching the 100 million people. And everybody is looking at the refugees coming from Ukraine, at least in the European perspective, but the situation is not improving, but the contrary is worsening in many places of the world, as Filippo has explained to us, from Afghanistan to Myanmar to the Horn of Africa. The amount of needs is increasing, and this will put a strong strain on our capacity to continue supporting financially these people. This will require, once again, to work on a joint Team Euro response. The consequences of this situation has to be faced by the European Union budget, but also and mainly from the European Union member states. The gap between the available resources will continue to expand. We must step up our efforts to shrink the needs and to become more efficient in delivering aid. But there is a strong need to scale up the resources available. And that we have been discussing today with a lot of preoccupation, because we know that this situation can create political instability and turmoil. And not to pay the price today of avoiding this crisis can come with a higher price tomorrow if this crisis develops. The ministers went out to the meeting very much aware of the situation and committed to act.
Thanks a lot, and we have the time for a couple of questions. I will start with you in the room, because you asked quite a few questions earlier, but you will start. You first, and then you, and then you.
Thank you very much. I have two questions. My first question is, there are efforts ongoing at the UN to create special corridors, humanitarian corridors, to export more of the grain that's stuck in Ukraine. But Russia obviously would need to be party to that agreement. Can you see that it would be realistic that the EU would agree to such a deal with Russia to get out the grain from Ukraine? And secondly, there is a real proliferation of international efforts now to deal with food security. There's the French Farm Initiative, there's the Global Alliance for Food Security from Germany and the G7. Is there a risk that a lot of these initiatives are going to counteract each other and there won't really be enough coordination? And should the EU step in and play more of a stronger coordinating role? Thanks.
Sí, gracias. Tratamos de hacer.
Yes, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to ensure that there is greater coordination, first and foremost amongst ourselves, which is quite a lot of work anyway. Team Europe doesn't have any magic powers. This is a call for action, but then we need to have concrete actions. Of course, we do need better coordination for these initiatives, but we need these initiatives to come up first. And in this way, we can channel our concerns and our resources, and then you have coordination afterwards. But it's not a bad thing that we have all these different initiatives, such as the one which has been put forward by the French presidency or the UN or the US. They're all most welcome. Afterwards, we have to try and ensure that they can work in a coordinated fashion. On the humanitarian corridors, we're not talking about humanitarian corridors, we're talking about transport corridors. We're not talking about transporting people, we're talking about transporting goods, something very basic. We're talking about sunflower seeds or wheat. We need the Russians to agree if we have to go through areas controlled by Russia. Of course, we have to unblock the Black Sea ports, and for that we need agreement from the Russians. But the waters there are full of mines. They are there partly as a defensive measure on the Ukrainian side, and also partly on the Russian side as a means of blocking the ports. So that's a difficult situation. Now, if we're talking about transport corridors and going through areas where there's no Russian control, then okay, that's one thing. At the moment, what we're trying to do is to try and open up other ports in the Black Sea. We're trying to work through Black Sea ports from EU member states and to try and get access to Ukrainian goods there. Now, if you have a train coming from wheat, it would have to go to a European Black Sea port. If we could reduce the amount of time that journey takes, it's taking 16 weeks at the moment. If we could reduce that time period, that would already be a major achievement.
You have the floor.
Buenas tardes. Sí, ¿me siente? Buenas tardes, alto representante.
Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Aleka from AGI, the Italian press agency. I have a first question regarding the Italian proposal to reach a peace agreement in Ukraine. It has been tabled at the UN and includes neutrality of Ukraine and some parts of Ukraine. Do you think that this could be a possible solution for ending the conflict? Then I have a second question on news which has just come in. I don't know if you know, but 3 Italians have been kidnapped in Mali. Do you have any comments on that? And do you have any news here? Thank you very much. Yes, I've taken note of what our Italian colleague has said regarding a peace plan presented by Italy to the Secretary General on the 19th of May. In the EU, we support any efforts being made in order to try and bring this conflict to an end. But from a European point of view, we are calling for an immediate stop to the aggression and the unconditional retreat of Russian troops from Ukrainian territory. If you want to talk about the conditions for this ceasefire, well, it's up to Ukraine to decide upon that. But we in the EU are just trying to support Ukraine. We're doing our utmost on the diplomatic front to try and achieve a ceasefire. But when negotiations take place, and I hope they will take place, we hope that Ukraine will be in a strong position at that juncture. And I would just call upon Europeans to maintain our unity on all fronts, diplomatic and military, vis-à-vis the Russian aggression against Ukraine.
Ali, but I'm not sure we got the... Do you have... have you seen it?
No tenemos más información.
We don't have any further information above and beyond what I said. After the defense ministers' meeting, we will be submitting a plan for rescheduling and a reduction of our presence in Mali. We have decided to suspend the troop training activities we had been engaging in there, and I do not expect to restart these activities in the near future. So we have to cut back on personnel, and this must be done in a coordinated fashion. And we think that if we're talking about redeploying personnel in other regions, we have to look at how this would actually work and how we can redefine our aims in the region so that we can carry on helping the population of Mali. But the troop training activities require large numbers of staff, almost 1,000 people. We will no longer need so many people, so we will cut back there. But I said to the member states that this should all take place in a coordinated fashion. We have to avoid having independent initiatives here and there, because this would only make this job more difficult for everybody.
So, Vince, you have the last question. I see that David doesn't have a question anymore, right? Vince, please.
Yes, thank you. Vince Chadwick from DevEx. Commissioner Urpilainen told the Development Committee on Monday that preserving funds for African countries is now her #1 priority in the light of the Ukraine conflict and the needs that the pressure that's going to come on the EU budget from that conflict. I'm aware that the commitments made to African partners at the summit in February was also based on the understanding that member states would contribute a large part of the funding, but I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about the Commission funding. Can you guarantee that when it comes to EU budget amounts, that the amounts that were programmed and have been carefully planned for African partners will be maintained and will not be cut or reallocated as we've seen in Sweden and Norway and other countries? Thank you.
Sin duda, África sigue.
Well, of course, Africa continues to be a priority for us in Europe. From a geopolitical point of view, this is our main priority. Well, the war in Ukraine was something it was completely unexpected. We, of course, have had to mobilize funding for Ukraine and for neighboring countries who have taken in 6 million people. But this is not to the detriment of funds which had been earmarked for Africa. Of course, when it comes to the financial envelopes earmarked for Africa, we might have differing priorities for our objectives. We did that when the pandemic struck. Our priority was to strengthen health systems rather than building roads, so health systems first. And I'm sure that now there will be certain objectives which have become a priority, because feeding people will be our main priority. But that would be within a restructuring of the financial envelopes. But overall, there won't be any decrease in our support for Africa.
Okay, this closes our press conference for today. Thank you, High Representative. Thank you all for your patience, and thanks a lot to the interpreters. Thank you.